Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast. I'm Laura Makin-Isherwood from London, and these are the top headlines of the day. US Vice President Kamala Harris meets with Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki in Warsaw, with their talks expected to discuss how to provide military assistance for Ukraine. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accuses the European Union and other countries of dangerously backing the supply of arms to Ukraine as the country resists an incursion by thousands of Russian troops. Kyiv and Moscow made no progress towards agreeing a ceasefire in tense talks in Turkey, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister says. Conservative South Korean opposition candidate Yoon Suk-yeol rides to victory in a tight presidential election following a wave of discontent over economic policy, scandals and gender wars. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party is set to keep control of India's most populous state with a big majority in an assembly vote that could offer clues to the national mood before the 2024 general election. Brent oil rebounds amid hopes that sanctions hit Russian oil could be largely replaced by other sources. The Vice President of the United States is in Poland, tasked with smoothing America's relationship with its key ally after a recent turbulent section over fighter jets. After her arrival in Warsaw, the American Vice President held a meeting with both the Prime Minister and President of Poland. The leaders discussed how to provide military assistance for Ukraine and further military coordination among allies.
Sorry, don't push me.
The trip was planned days before the recent rift over fighter jets between Poland and the United States. Warsaw took Washington by surprise by offering to send jets to Ukraine via an American airbase, although Washington has rejected that proposal. The Pentagon has now deployed 2 air defence units to Poland, though, to bolster its system of defence. America's 2 Patriot surface-to-air missile batteries have been repositioned from Germany to Poland as Washington tries to secure the NATO alliance territory against any potential threat. The Pentagon refrained from specifying their operational status, but did confirm that the missiles were manned. Nuclear tensions remain, however, as some worry that the Russian president may escalate the war further after Vladimir Putin put his nuclear forces on heightened alert a few days ago. US officials, though, have not yet detected any threatening changes in Russia's nuclear posture.
The whole backdrop to this relationship with Ukraine at the moment in terms of assisting them is that keeping in mind ways to avoid having the war spill over into any of the neighboring countries, some of which are NATO countries. And if that were to happen, of course, then you would have a war of NATO against Russia. And the implication there is that it could potentially escalate to a nuclear war. Nobody wants that.
Well, our correspondent Rosie Burchard is joining us live from Brussels now. Rosie, this meeting obviously comes after a very public dismissal by the United States of Poland's offer for fighter jets to be passed to them. So is it all about rebuilding relations?
Well, Laura, we can't say for sure whether these 2
events are linked, but what we can say is that it's certainly something that will be music to the ears of Poland. This is something Warsaw has been calling for. Poland, of course, shares a long border with Ukraine, and it's one of several NATO allies that asked for what's called Article 4 consultations in recent weeks, and that essentially means it feels threatened. Poland sharing that border with Ukraine and, of course, feeling very exposed at this time. The core of this really is that Poland is part of NATO defensive alliance, and that means it can expect defensive support from other NATO allies like the United States. There are thousands of US troops in Poland, both bilaterally and through NATO. So this is something, as I said, Poland has been calling for. Now, of course, Ukraine, on the other hand, is not a member of NATO, and that's so much the core of this conflict. Ukraine has been very forthright in its criticism of NATO countries, saying they have not been doing enough. Of course, Ukraine had asked for this no-fly zone. That was a no-go for NATO, and it's for similar reasons that we saw this fighter jet deal simply being dismissed by the United States, and it's because there are fears that if NATO was seen to be really sending any troops or aircraft directly into the Ukrainian territory, that could be seen as an escalation and lead to what NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg said would be a fully fledged war with even greater consequences for human suffering.
And Rosie, EU heads of state are also going to meet later to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. The bloc has already imposed heavy sanctions on Russia, but can we expect more action?
Laura, there are these two big institutions here in Brussels, NATO and the European Union. They share more than 20 members, and those EU heads of state are headed to Versailles in France for some serious talks amid what is, of course, very escalating crisis and very tense times here in Europe. We understand that those heads of state will be discussing Europe's energy dependence on Russia. Until very recently, at least, around 40% of EU gas imports came from Russia. That's of high concern, and they are trying to really cut that dependency by at least 2/3 by the end of this year. We recently had a new announcement of fresh sanctions from the European Union. Now the number of individuals under asset freezes and travel bans is 862 for those linked to this particular conflict. But they'll likely be having discussions about what further sanctions could come next and what could trigger them. Those will all be behind closed doors, and because they raise some very uncomfortable questions, namely just how bad is this going to get and what could be the trigger for an even bigger package of sanctions toward Moscow. And this all comes, of course, as suffering in Ukraine continues and Ukrainians face another day of conflict.
Rosie Burchard in Brussels, thank you. The president of Ukraine has accused Russia of carrying out genocide on their soil. A Russian aircraft bombed a children's hospital, burying patients in the rubble, despite a ceasefire deal in Mariupol. Volodymyr Zelensky has repeated his call for the West to tighten sanctions on Russia, calling Russian attacks war crimes and genocide.
The occupiers are doing to Mariupol is beyond atrocities. Europeans, Ukrainians, Mariupol. Today we must be united in condemning this war crime of Russia, which reflects all the evil that the occupiers have brought to our land. An aerial bomb on a maternity hospital is the conclusive evidence that what is happening is a genocide of Ukrainians.
Well, these are the latest satellite images of the southern Ukrainian city of Mariupol. It shows the extensive damage to the civilian infrastructure in and around the besieged city. Residential homes, high-rise apartment buildings, grocery stores and shopping centres have been destroyed, including the Port City shopping mall in the west of the city. The imagery was collected before a reported bombing and shelling of a children's hospital in the city. Well, our correspondent Anas Malik is in Kiev right now, bringing us all the latest updates by the hour. Let's go across to Kiev now. Anas, how have the last few hours been on the ground there?
Well, the last few hours, Mackin, have been very, very tensed. I'm at the railway station, and people are using this opportunity to basically get out of the city. Now, this is the railway station right behind me, if you can see, and you can probably see the amount of people that are there at the main platform. These are evacuation buses that are being used to evacuate people from elsewhere or nearby in the city, getting them to Kiev and then onwards to safety. I tried going to Bucha a short while back, and it was to no luck. We escaped from being shelled literally meters ahead, by just meters. We were on the way to Bucha, just outside Kiev, when there was shelling being done. It is unclear from which side it was being done, but given that we were on the Ukrainian side and very near to the Ukrainian forces, so it is understood, or it is presumed, that it was being carried out by the Russian forces. Now, there are hundreds and hundreds of people, you can see behind me, families who are leaving or trying to flee to safety through the railway station to elsewhere in the country, mostly towards Lviv, to the western part of the country, and then onwards to the European side. Mackin?
Anas, how regular are those trains leaving Kyiv? Because obviously there are still thousands of people trying to get onto those. Are they still managing to get an escape route safely?
Well, on paper, there are about 9 trains that are to leave on daily basis from Kiev to elsewhere in the country, basically towards Lviv in the western town or the western city of Lviv. But practically, having been here for a couple of days, there are only 2 trains that are heading out of the city. One is at local time 2 p.m. and the other is at 3 p.m. local time. Now, both the trains have been made free of cost. Anybody who intends on leaving the city of Kiev can travel without a ticket. They do not have to pay for a ticket. That's what the railway authorities have done, and that is the reason we're seeing this mass exodus taking place. The city of Kiev is empty by about 90%. Most of the people who you'd see out on the roads are either the army personnel or press or the volunteers. The citizens who have chosen to stay back are mostly those who are going to the supermarket in order to stock up their everyday items so that they can live off in case of an incursion or in case if the supplies are cut off. Now, it is pertinent to mention that the city of Kiev is being fed off through these supplies that are coming in from the west. So these trains, when they take passengers from Kiev to Lviv, on the back, when they return mostly empty, I took one of these trains into Kiev. They're mostly empty and they're full of items that are there. Mackin?
And obviously, there's been repeated calls by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to close the skies above Ukraine to try to prevent this shelling. There was that bombardment of the maternity hospital that shocked the world. How is President Zelensky reacting to that? What's his latest calls?
Well, President Zelensky has called in as an act of atrocity. It is beyond atrocity, as what he has put up in his Telegram video, as it has been specified. Now, we've seen after that, we've seen digital signboards going up in the city of Kiev which say NATO close the skies now, and the Ukrainians are not requesting this, they're begging for it. So you'd see these digital signboards along the roads of Kiev quite a number. There is a general grimness in the air, this tension that can be felt. As I said, I was just about an hour back, while I was on the way towards Bucha from the city of Kiev, just in the outskirts of Kiev, we escaped being shelled. That was presumed from the Russian side. So that explains the magnitude of the situation, how bad or worrisome the situation is, because you don't know when or where can the next shell land. Mackin?
Anas, well, do take care when you're out there on the ground. Anas Malik in Kyiv, thank you. The British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has called on G7 countries to ban Russian oil imports. Liz Truss spoke at a joint press conference with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the State Department in Washington and said that the world's leading economies should go further and faster in punishing Moscow for invading Ukraine.
We know from history that aggressors only understand one thing, and that is strength. We know that if we don't do enough now, other aggressors around the world will be emboldened. And we know that if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, there will be terrible implications for European and global security. We would be sending a message that sovereign nations can simply be trampled on. So we must go further and faster in our response. We must double down on our sanctions. That includes a full SWIFT ban and the G7 ending its use of Russian oil and gas.
Liz Truss hailed transatlantic unity against Russian aggression, saying that the strength of the alliance has surprised President Vladimir Putin. On Tuesday, the United States banned imports of oil and gas in a bid to block Russia's economic lifeline. Canada and the UK also pledged to end imports within a year. Other countries from the Group of Seven, France, Germany, Italy and Japan, are yet to make such a move. Blinken also highlighted the anti-Moscow cooperation and blasted Russia for what he called failure to ensure safe passage of civilians from Ukrainian cities and towns.
I think it's important to remember that throughout this crisis created by Putin and Russia, we've sought to provide possible off-ramps to President Putin. He's the only one who can decide whether or not to take them. So far, every time there's been an opportunity to do just that, he's pressed the accelerator and continued down this horrific road that he's been pursuing. I'm absolutely convinced that Putin will fail and Russia will suffer a strategic defeat, no matter what short-term tactical gains it may make in Ukraine.
Meanwhile, Germany will host a virtual meeting of agricultural ministers from G7 countries. Leaders will discuss the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on global food security. Unprecedented sanctions against Russia's banks over its invasion of Ukraine are taking their toll on citizens overseas. A number of Russian citizens who are currently on tour abroad are scrambling to find cash or are turning to crypto transactions to get by. Konstantin Ivanov is a Russian national stuck in Indonesia, and this is what his daily life has become post-invasion.
When Konstantin Ivanov tried to withdraw money from his Russian bank account at a cash machine in Bali, he quickly realised the transaction was blocked. The 27-year-old is one of the Russians abroad feeling the squeeze from economic sanctions, despite living far away from home.
This has created a huge problem for us. Basically going to shops to buy products, to pay at the markets, paying for staying at hotels, villas or guest houses. We have been left completely stripped of our finances. It's like they have been completely frozen and we cannot use our finances at all over here.
Bali is a popular holiday destination with Russian tourists. More than 1,100 entered Indonesia in January, according to data from the Statistics Bureau. Rifki Saldiyanto is a cafe manager. He says there's been a decline in Russian customers in recent days, and many now pay with cash instead of credit card. MasterCard and Visa have suspended services in Russia, and many of the country's banks have been shut out of international payment systems. Now, some Russians have sought to open bank accounts in Indonesia, like Ruslan. He says the Russian community is banding together to help each other out.
I heard from my Russian friends about their financial troubles. But you know how it is with us Russians. We help each other. I have a local bank account, and I will help my friends, as they helped me to with their money. I will send my money to their bank, and so we Russians will help each other, as we are now the only ones left. We have no one else to help but ourselves.
Despite the financial troubles, Konstantin is hopeful for a peaceful resolution to the conflict.
I think ordinary Russian people are very disappointed with the recent events and developments. Absolutely no one needs a war. People of our country do not need a war, and neither do the people of Ukraine. Nobody wanted this war. We are really worried. Nobody wants war. We all need peace.
Russian President Vladimir Putin and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz discussed diplomatic ways to settle the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The Kremlin said that the two leaders also discussed the implementation of humanitarian corridors to evacuate citizens. The statement said various political and diplomatic efforts have been discussed, in particular a third round of talks between a Russian delegation and representatives of the Kyiv authorities. Putin informed Schultz of the measures he says are being taken to evacuate civilians. The two countries agreed to open more humanitarian corridors on Wednesday to evacuate civilians. Many Ukrainian cities have witnessed intense bombings, and there are new concerns after the Chernobyl nuclear power plant faced a power cut. As Russia continues its aggression in Ukraine, tremors are still being felt in Syria after 7 years following Moscow's backing of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime.
Abu Ahmad is a Syrian rebel fighter. As he follows the news from Ukraine, he is reminded of the pivotal role Moscow played in turning the tide of the conflict in favor of President Bashar al-Assad. Ahmad and his group held out for years against government forces in eastern Ghouta until Russian air power came to Assad's aid in 2015.
The aggressive Russian campaign that was held against us has tipped the scales in favor of the enemy. They followed a scorched-the-earth policy.
Eastern Ghouta, on the outskirts of Damascus, suffered the longest-running siege in modern history, more than 5 years before succumbing in 2018 to a Russian back offensive. UN investigators found the siege and recapture of the region were marked by war crimes and crimes against humanity. Ahmad left eastern Ghouta and ended up in Tadef, along with tens of thousands of other Syrians, when it fell to government forces, leaving through a safe corridor to the rebel-held north instead of risking life back under Assad's rule. Such corridors were a feature of the war as Assad's opponents stream out of defeated enclaves all over Syria. In Ukraine, evacuation corridors have opened in some cities to help residents to flee, but both sides have accused each other of breaking ceasefires. Syria's main front lines have been frozen for several years, and the country is split into separate zones where Russia, Turkey and the United States hold sway. Though Tadef is mostly calm these days, the aftermath of war can be seen everywhere. As 26-year-old Sheikh Ahmad Taha watches the news about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which Moscow calls a special operation, he has this advice for Ukrainians.
I advise Ukrainians not to go to war with the Russians. Russians are stronger, they have stronger weapons. This is my only advice.
A new tide of politics has swept South Korea, and liberal politics appears to have come to an end. Conservative opposition leader Yoon Suk-yeol has been elected as the new president of the country.
South Korea has a new president. Conservative opposition candidate Yoon Suk-yeol was elected in one of the most closely fought races in recent history, which will shape Asia's fourth largest economy for the next 5 years. Yoon, who is 60, edged out the ruling Democratic Party's Lee Jae-myung by a fraction. A formal announcement is expected to be made on Thursday. The People Power Party candidate said he would work with opposition parties to heal polarized politics and foster national unity, calling the election a, quote, victory of the great people. Yoon's 5-year term will begin this month to replace incumbent President Moon Jae-in, who is constitutionally barred from seeking re-election. The White House congratulated Yoon, saying President Joe Biden looked forward to working closely with him to bolster the alliance. Despite being a political novice, Yoon shot to fame after spearheading high-profile investigations into corruption scandals engulfing Moon's aides.
We have to stop the corrupt and incompetent ruling forces' attempt to extend their term and plunder people.
He has pledged to stamp out graft, foster justice, and create a more level playing field while seeking a reset with China and a tougher stance towards reclusive North Korea. More than 77% of South Korea's 44 million eligible voters cast ballots to pick their next leader, despite an unprecedented surge in new COVID-19 cases, with a record 342,446 posted on Wednesday.
And finally, one of South Korea's largest broadcasters has used 3D animation technology to add a dash of fun to their presidential election coverage. In this unique election visual on television, the presidential candidates Lee Jae-myung and Yoon Suk-yeol are competing in Winter Olympic sport events, slipping from their seats at amusement park rides and riding to victory. We'll leave you with these visuals. Thanks so much for watching.
This is right, Arab.